First, thanks to the Wheatley Institution for sponsoring this lecture and the conference of which it's a part. It's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Robert Keohane of Princeton University. In service of the field, Professor Keohane is widely regarded as the most influential scholar of international relations and one of the most renowned political scientists working. He is author of numerous seminal works, including Transnational Relations of World Politics, Power and Interdependence, After Hegemony, Designing Social Inquiry, and many other highly cited books and articles. This lecture, as noted, is the keynote for Professional Conference on Experiments in International Relations. And in key ways, it seeks to extend Professor Keohane's work in research design, in causal inference, and in transnational relations. Professor Keohane is past president of both the International Studies Association and the American Political Science Association, the two leading associations for our field, and editor of the field-leading journal International Organization. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, and there are many, many other accolades I could list that are part of his vita. But I'd like to focus on one aspect of Professor Keohane's career and his work, for which he's perhaps gets too little credit. He is known as one of the best mentors in political science. An extraordinary number of leading scholars of political science were students of Robert Keohane, and numerous others, including many in this room, have benefited from his guidance and encouragement and critical, constructive criticism. If you permit a personal note, I was a young assistant professor in my third year at BYU in 2000, the year 2000, when I spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at Duke University, where Professor Keohane was on the faculty. On many occasions, he went out of his way to meet with me, invite me to lunch, to professional dinners, to read my work and engage it critically. He was then, as now, the leading academic in his field, and I was an especially obscure BYU professor. So to this day, his interest in me and my work remains one of the most generous acts that I've witnessed in my professional career. I'm far from the only one who could say that. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Keohane.
Thank you, Dan, for the warm and flattering introduction. It's not just generosity. I think that when you get to be a certain age, you learn a lot more from listening to younger people than they probably learn from you. But certainly, you learn more than by not listening to younger people. So it was a mutual benefit, our relationship. I'm very pleased to be at BYU. I was recalling that I spoke here last exactly 25 years ago. I think almost to the day, because you can look it up on your iPhones, because the Bork hearings were going on for the Supreme Court. He was not confirmed, and it was a big sensation. I remember listening to them on the way down and in the hotel here. So that was ancient history, of course, from the point of view of most people here. More than 90 years ago, at the end of World War I, Max Weber gave two now famous lectures, published in English as Science as a Vocation and Politics as a Vocation. They well repay reading and rereading. They're short, and so if you haven't read them, I recommend you do so. Thinking of those lectures, it seemed appropriate to me to reflect on political science as a vocation. As the title of my lecture indicates, I'm directing my comments both to my fellow political scientists in the audience and to students in attendance here who are maybe beginning careers in our field. Now, I gave this version of this lecture. I told, this is not news to our sponsors, I told them when I agreed to do it, that I'd given a version of this lecture at the Sheffield Graduate School of Politics in 2008, which was directed principally toward graduate students. There may be still some remnants of that focus, but I realized that this audience is colleagues on the one hand and undergraduates on the other. But I'm going to reflect on our vocation from the vantage point of someone who has been a practicing political scientist, teaching, reflecting, and writing about politics for 47 years. It's hard for me to say that. It's hard for me to believe that, but it's true. I began by pointing out that viewed historically, you are in distinguished company. Aristotle was probably the first systematic Western political scientist, theorizing the relationship of politics to other spheres of life and creating a typology of regimes. He created what we would now call comparative politics, and this was in the 4th century BC. Machiavelli not only advised the prince, but sought to analyze the nature of leadership, the characteristic hypocrisy of political speech, which is not a new phenomenon and is certainly still a current one, and the sources of republican greatness. Hobbes provided what is still one of the most compelling discussions of the causes of political violence and the sources of and justification for the state. Montesquieu and Madison developed a durable theory of constitutionalism, and Tocqueville put forward insights into the nature of democracy that remain vibrant today, for example, in the work of Robert Putnam. I've already mentioned Max Weber. In the generation of political scientists born in the first 3 decades of this century, I would list somewhat arbitrarily Gabriel Almond, Robert Dahl, Elinor Ostrom, Judith Sklar, and Kenneth Waltz, all of whom profoundly affected our knowledge of politics. Together, there are so many fine colleagues doing insightful work now that to mention a few would be to risk slighting others whose work is equally important. The point is that you are, if you decide to do so, to the undergraduates, if you decide to go on to join in the political science profession and become a graduate student and then a faculty member in it, you are joining a vibrant profession with a rich history. And if you are studying it, you are studying in a profession with a rich history, and I hope that your instructors don't start the syllabus in 1975. If I were conversant with classical Indian and Chinese sources, I could probably add to this list and extend this history even further into the past. Following Virginia Woolf, many of you probably noticed that except for Ostrom and Sklar, this is a procession of men. Fortunately, however, this lamentable situation, which was characteristic of this profession as well as others, has changed. If I had listed a contemporary political scientist of note, I would have had to include Theda Skocpol, Margaret Levy, Carol Pateman, and Suzanne Rudolph, all of whom have been president of the association, as well as many younger women who are now leaders in the field. Although exclusion on the basis of gender and race was long a reality, our profession is now increasingly open to talented people from a wide variety of backgrounds. What then is political science? What do we mean by it? I have an economist colleague who likes to say that any discipline with science in its name is not really a science, that it protests too much. We're one to adopt a narrow view of science as requiring mathematical formulations of its propositions, precise quantitative testing, or even experimental validation. Political science would indeed, for the most part, be an oxymoron. But today, I will defend our nomenclature by taking a broader view. I define politics as involving attempts to organize human groups to determine internal rules and externally to compete and cooperate with other organized groups, and reactions to such attempts. This definition is meant to encompass a range of activities, from the governance of a democracy such as Great Britain to warfare, from corporate takeovers to decisions made in the UN Security Council. It includes acts of leadership and resistance to leadership, behavior resulting from deference and from defiance. I define science as a publicly known set of procedures designed to make and evaluate descriptive and causal inferences on the basis of the self-conscious application of methods that are themselves subject to public evaluation. As transparency, public evaluation, and criticism are inherent in science. All science is carried out with the understanding that all conclusions are uncertain and subject to revision or refutation. So political science is simply the study of politics through the procedures of science. Most of my lecture will be devoted to an explication of how, in my view, political science should be carried out. That is, the process of thinking and research that yield insights into politics. But I want to begin by talking about teaching. Teaching is sometimes disparaged. Colleagues bargain to reduce their, quote, teaching loads. The language is revealing, since we speak of research opportunities, but teaching loads. National and global reputations are built principally on written work, as Dan has implied, not on teaching. But when we look around, we see that virtually all top-ranked political scientists in the world today are active teachers. Some are not good teachers, but they're all active teachers. Few of them have spent their careers at research institutes or think tanks. In my view, there's a reason for this. Teaching undergraduates compels one to put arguments into ordinary language, accessible to undergraduates, and therefore to smart people who have not absorbed the arcane language of social science, which can be evasive as well as it can be illuminating. Teaching graduate students exposes one to new ideas from younger and more supple minds, as long as the students are sufficiently critical of the professor's views. I want to emphasize this point about criticism, because in my experience, most students, but rarely the best, are too deferential. And in fact, one of the disappointments in my career, I think, is that students were less deferential in the 60s and 70s than they are now. They're more deferential now, and it's a bad thing. In 1927, so the story goes, I think it's a true story, it comes out of my father's notebooks, but he was an honest man. The Chief Justice of the United States, former President William Howard Taft, came to Yale Law School, where his host was the Chancellor of Yale Law School, Robert Maynard Hutchins. Taft was the former president, Chief Justice, a man of ample girth, 350 pounds, so somewhat pompous, as well as very intelligent and distinguished, and he was a conservative. Hutchins was dean at 28 years old. He was a radical. Yale was seen as a radical place. So the Chief Justice said to Chancellor Hutchins, "Well, I understand that you at Yale teach your students that all judges are fools." To which Robert Maynard replied, quick as a wink, "No, Mr. Chief Justice, at Yale we teach our students to find that out for themselves." Like the Yale law students, you need to discover for yourself which senior political scientists are wise and which are fools. It doesn't come from their CVs or their nominal reputations or from their titles. And you have to do so by using your own critical facilities. Teaching is rewarding in other ways. I've learned a lot from my colleagues and directly from my students, who come to me with insights or works to read that were suggested to them by other faculty members. And over the long run, one may see former undergraduate students become politicians or even rise to high other positions. A former student of mine is now a U.S. Senator. Another one just retired as president of the World Bank. Both undergraduates, of course. The graduate students are all professors. With former PhD students, ties are much stronger since they remain in the profession. Two of my most valued colleagues and best friends at Princeton are former students, including Helen Milner, who I think is in the audience somewhere. I don't see Helen, but I don't have my glasses on. She's co-running this conference, and the eminent student of the European Union, Andrew Moravcik. Former students of mine are scattered at colleges and universities around the United States, with some in Europe or Japan. In my office, I keep a shelf of books that began as PhD dissertations under my supervision. Never disparage teaching. It's an intrinsic part of political science as a vocation. Furthermore, it provides much more immediate gratification than research. When I'm working on a major project, I never know whether the results will be worthwhile. I've left unpublished a good deal of work when I realized that the premises or methods that I used were flawed. Sometimes even one's published work will be ignored. Like politics for Weber, research can seem like the long, hard boring of hard boards, in his phrase. The eventual awards may be substantial or may be meager. You never know until quite a bit later. If you give a good lecture or teach a lively, thoughtful seminar, however, the gratification is immediate. You know you accomplished something that day. During periods of self-doubt, teaching can keep you going. Now let me turn to the science in political science. Turning to research. What do political scientists do? What are the processes they go through in the search for knowledge? And I'm going to focus on 4 activities. First is puzzling, conceptualizing, describing, and making causal inferences. First, puzzling. Interesting work begins not just, in my view, not just with a problem, for example, how does democracy work in the United States, but with a puzzle. Puzzles are anomalies. What we observe does not fit with our preconceptions based on established theory. Hobbes sought to make sense of civil war and regicide. Tocqueville wanted to understand how a decentralized, individualized society, such as the United States in the 1830s, could exhibit such overall cohesion and even suffer from oppressive public opinion, in his view. Barrington Moore and a line of successors have sought to explain why some societies develop stable democracies while others do not. Dita Scotchwell and others seek to account for great revolutions and their absence. Great leaps forward in political science often take place when someone sees puzzles where others have only seen facts. The great philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, says that, quote, science proceeds on a sea of anomalies, which certainly applies to political science. That is, science only really progresses when you find anomalies, puzzles that don't fit established either conventional wisdom or established theory, not when you just plug away at adding crossing the T or dotting the I. Now, I'm not very satisfied with much of political science today. It seems to me it often just does call attention to relationships that conventional thinking expects to obtain. And I think there's a herd instinct in political science. I think it's been quite marked in the last decade or two, where people follow the same lines of work, just adding small amounts to it. So showing with more precision that democracies are relatively peaceful toward one another is an example. It's an important piece of knowledge that they are. The 150th article estimating in a little different way how they are, it seems to me, is not. That civil wars thrive in poorly governed countries with places to hide, or that economic failure is bad for incumbents, resolves no major puzzles. Now, it's important then, I think, to begin with an interesting puzzle, for which the answer is not obvious. So one implication of my point here is find something puzzling to study. Don't just stop when you found something that is a topic in political science, which is a subject matter. And there's another implication of the importance of puzzles. Never dismiss what appears to be a naive question. This is true for teaching, it's also true in research. The naive questions are often the most fundamental ones. And I'll tell you a true story which taught me this. I was at Stanford in the 1970s, teaching political science with no training in economics, trying to understand economics better. And I was trying to pick it up on the fly by attending economics seminars. I walk across the street and attend economics seminars. I remember one such seminar by an eminent student of multinational corporations, whose work I knew. He spoke very well in a highly organized way. After about 3 minutes, in true economics fashion, a young bearded man raised his hand to ask a question, which the speaker answered to my satisfaction. After 3 or 4 minutes, the same hand went up again. Then again, a few minutes later, with a different question, each seeming rather obvious to me. After 3 or 4 questions, I was getting annoyed and impatient. I was saying to myself, can't you let the speaker proceed? After 5 or 6 questions, it dawned on me, perhaps I was the last person in the room to see it, that the questioner was the only person in the room who understood the topic. That his series of apparently naive questions had dismantled the foundations of this professor's talk. There was literally nothing left. I've forgotten everything else about the seminar, except I remember how the room looked and where the guy was. And I know who he was now. But the apparently naive questions of this questioner had dismantled the talk's premises. So if the lesson is that apparently naive questions are often the most fundamental. And if you are puzzled, ask. In our field, there are no dumb questions. It's true. Probably 90%, maybe 95% of naive questions are just that. They're naive. You don't understand what the speaker said. And then you can only gain by asking the question because you learn something from it. Maybe 5% of the time, you may be the only person in the room, like this person, to see the anomaly, to sense like a good detective that there is something wrong about the story you're being told. So the rewards of identifying major puzzles for the profession and for yourself are very large indeed. After you have a puzzle, the next step is conceptualization, being clear about the meaning of concepts. Giovanni Sartori pointed out long ago that concepts get stretched out of shape by political scientists trying to do too much with too little. And much often depends on definitions. How we think about the relationship between democracy and liberty, for example, depends on how we conceptualize democracy and liberty. Are they in conflict or not? Likewise, whether democracies ever fight one another or whether international institutions degrade or enhance democracy depends heavily on how one defines democracy. Whether civil wars are becoming more or less frequent may turn on how we conceptualize what is a civil war, rather than a lesser form of civil conflict. And whether peace requires justice or is at odds and in conflict with justice depends on how we define both of these contested terms. There are, in my view, no right or wrong definitions. I'm a positivist in that way. But there are explicit and implicit definitions, those consistent with ordinary usage and those that are not. And authors can be consistent or inconsistent in their use of terms. At the conceptualization stage, it's our obligation to put forward explicit definitions. I tried to define political science earlier in this lecture, and to seek to operationalize them consistently. The more our definitions conform to ordinary usage, furthermore, the less confusion is likely to result. And I come to description and interpretation. The core of what most political scientists do most of the time is descriptive inference. Inference means drawing more general conclusions from established premises plus a particular set of facts. For example, from known facts, such as that each of 150 countries has a particular form of government and particular economic characteristics, we may infer that there's a correlation between wealth and democracy. That's a descriptive inference. Properly speaking, though, such a conclusion rests on a chain of inferences. It's often necessary to probe those. For instance, we may have inferred from a sample survey of tax returns what per capita GDP is for the country, and from observation of 3 elections where the country is democratically governed. These inferences are subject to error. People might systematically falsify their tax returns in one country, for example, and not in another. The incumbent government might conceal decisive manipulations from election monitors. Other examples of descriptive inferences in political science are the generalization that democracies don't fight one another, the claim that international institutions typically provide information to governments about other governments' compliance with rules, and Moravcik's claim that the European Union was formed by leaders concerned more about economic gains than security benefits. So the examples indicate that descriptive inferences can be generalizations about a wide set of cases or statements about a particular set of events at a particular time and place. We can make inferences about individuals, for example, the sincerity or hypocrisy of leaders, or their perceptions of other leaders' behavior. We can also make inferences about the behavior of collective actors that may have subunits pulling in different directions, what the United Kingdom or China did in a situation, or whether the United States, or rather unauthorized individuals, engage in torture at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo. And we can make inferences about relationships. Were there back-channel communications during the Cuban Missile Crisis between the Soviet ambassador and Robert M. Kennedy? And if so, what were they about? Are the informal conversations between Israeli and U.S. leaders today as hostile as might be inferred from their public comments? Often, political scientists try to make their descriptive inferences more precise by attaching numbers to whatever process they are seeking to understand. Precision is certainly enhanced by numbers that are both reliable and valid, so such activities are to be encouraged. But it's important to recognize the importance of both reliability and validity. Reliability essentially means that using the criteria publicly employed, the number could be replicated by an independent observer. If by criteria defining wars as organized violence involving 1,000 or more deaths, one team of observers finds 50 wars at a given period of time, another team using the same criteria should also find 50 wars. That's the reliability side. You get the same answer to the same question if you do it again. Validity is different. It refers to whether the measurement used, in this case 1,000 battle casualties, fairly reflects the underlying phenomenon being discussed, that is war. Are all conflicts involving 1,000 deaths war? Even if some involve small societies, so that 1,000 deaths is a large portion of the population, and some involve very large societies that suffer more deaths by traffic accidents in a couple of weeks. Should all wars, from the skirmish that took 1,100 lives to World War II, be counted equally? Are they all wars? You see right away, these are constructions. These aren't factual descriptions. They depend on an interpretation of what we mean by a term, what we mean by war, and how we're going to categorize things. And very often our conclusions rely on these, and all too often people don't interrogate the interpretations that lie behind the supposed descriptions. So these are questions of validity that can't themselves be solved by quantification, but for which one has to think hard about how one's conceptualization relates to the phenomena that can be measured. Are we measuring what we're meaning to measure? So before we accept a descriptive inference, we need to have asked questions about validity as well as reliability. This issue is highlighted by the famous philosophical distinction between a wink and a twitch. As Clifford Geertz writes, Quote, "The difference between a wink and a twitch is vast, as anyone unfortunate enough to have taken the first for the second can tell." And one might add, vice versa. If you see someone who is attractive to you moving her eyelids rapidly, you need to engage in interpretation before moving to a descriptive inference. If you interpret the eye movement as a wink, you may infer she loves me too. But woe to you if you act on that interpretation and it was only a twitch. Political scientists engage in interpretation all the time. When states reject a public offer, as Spain has rejected loan terms from the European Central Bank, are they really rejecting it entirely, or are they establishing a bargaining position? When the United States brings an auto trade case against China, as it did this week, is it seeking to maintain a level playing field or to help President Obama's re-election chances? In Ohio, in particular. When Hillary Clinton was overseas during the Democratic National Convention, was she merely following nonpartisan tradition for Secretary of State, or was she signaling disinterest in a run for the presidency, or perhaps signaling interest in a run for the presidency through an odd twist of logic? My point about descriptive inference is twofold. It's not the same as simple description. We may think we're describing something as like I'm describing, I'm hitting this table. It involves an inference from known to unknown that can be incorrect or otherwise flawed. And both description and descriptive inference often rest on the interpretation of inherently, sometimes deliberately ambiguous actions, such as the wink twitch. Now I come to causal inference. Causality necessarily involves consideration of a counterfactual situation. If Charles II had not been executed in 1649, would Great Britain have a different political system now? If nuclear weapons had not been invented, would the United States and the Soviet Union have fought World War III in the 1950s? If the United States had not supported democratization in Egypt, would the Muslim Brotherhood be in charge there now? Since we cannot observe, inherently cannot observe at the same time what actually happened and what didn't happen, making causal inferences is always difficult. Descriptive inferences are hard enough, but causal inferences are really difficult because you can't observe both the action and the non-action. You can't observe the two situations simply. So we do not observe causality. You never observe causality. You always infer causality, and it's always a problematic or uncertain inference. Now, if we can find and measure many highly similar instances of the same action, for example, votes for parliament or expressions of party preference in surveys, we might be able to make quite good causal inferences through the use of quantitative methods. If it's a common unit, is unit homogeneity in the jargon word. So a vote is a vote is a vote, as opposed to being different kinds of actions. But even then, our procedures may contaminate our findings. For example, people often make up answers to public opinion polls because they don't want to seem not to know something. We know they recall having voted for winning candidates more than can actually have been the case. You can prove that with high significance that more people voted for a presidential winner than actually voted for a presidential winner, which of course is a contradiction, because afterwards they will report that. More seriously, our inferences may be flawed because of omitted variables. Something else changed that we failed to measure. And this change, rather than one on which we focused, may explain what we want to understand. Or we can confront endogeneity. What we stipulate is the effect is actually in whole or part a cause. There's a reciprocal relationship, for example. Furthermore, anticipation of consequences may create false impressions of causality. States may comply with international law not because they have incentives to follow it, or because they believe they are obliged to do so, but because they have carefully agreed only to rules in which they intended in any event to comply. If that's the case, it might appear to be causal, that the law leads to the action, but it would not be true, given my assumption. Conversely, real causality may be obscured. Political scientists seeking to determine the effect of deterrence threats and international crises did not find any significant effects. But critics point out that states that would submit to deterrent threats should have anticipated the threats and their submission, and therefore not have stimulated crises in the first place. The difficulties of causal inference seem endless. Indeed, I'm here at BYU today because of an attempt led by some members of your faculty, such as Dan, to explore another approach to the problem of causal inference: experiments. Experiments are standard in medicine, not yet in political science. Now, it's not possible to experiment on some issues, We can't replace the Egyptian military regime a year ago on the one Mubarak with on the one hand a military dictatorship, or on the other hand a secular democracy, and see how they would react differently to attacks on an American embassy. But for problems on which we can use experiments, the method has enormous advantages. In this conference that some of us are going to, we'll talk about those. But there are also limitations of this and any other method. The one limitation of experimental methods is what is known as external validity. You may be quite sure that you got the right answer and you have a causal inference for this particular set of people at this time, in this place, in this context. There's no guarantee that in a context that's even a little bit different, the same result will obtain. And with respect to large-scale problems, like the ones I'm mostly interested in, experiments will probably always remain unavailable. Unfortunately for science, but probably fortunately for the human race, we cannot manipulate large-scale political phenomena for our convenience, even if human subjects committees would allow us to do so. So on these issues, our causal inferences are always likely to be problematic. We could not construct the French Revolution and have that be the treatment, and have no French Revolution not be the placebo. Aspirations to causal inference are often linked to hopes for prediction. Our causal knowledge of gravity helps us to predict the movement of planets and other celestial objects, and our causal knowledge of biology and increasingly genetics help us to predict the incidence of disease. Sometimes we can make predictions, for example, of election outcomes on the basis of economic conditions, but even our best predictions are imperfect. For my own subject of international politics, the situation is even worse because it revolves around conscious strategies of reflective actors. I act as I do because I anticipate what you will do. But you, knowing this, act differently than I expect, and I, in turn, anticipating this, change my behavior. This is an infinite regress about which no prediction can be made. One would have to know how many cycles the players would go through, but if this could be ascertained, smart players would learn it and go one step further. So why choose political science as a vocation? If causal inferences in our field and prediction are as intractable as I have argued, why should we choose our profession? My short answer is that we study politics not because it is beautiful or easy to understand, but because it's so important to all fields of human endeavor. I readily admit that I cannot prove that politics is important. Weber in Science as a Vocation says that the presupposition that something is worth knowing cannot be proved by scientific methods. It can only be interpreted with reference to its ultimate meaning. That's a quote. Without governance, though, as Hobbes said, life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Democracy is, in my view, however flawed it is, and I'll mention that in a minute, immensely better than autocracy, much less tyranny. But making democracy work is hard and imposing. And imposing democracy seems close to impossible. Now, ironically, to me it's ironic, around the world, the flaws of democracy are becoming increasingly evident in the wake of the spread of democracy worldwide and its general celebration. At the same time, we have a celebration of democracy. The last 15 years has probably been the period of the greatest celebration of democracy in the history of the world, and yet you can't pick up a newspaper or a political science journal without seeing the pathologies of one democracy or another. One of the really interesting experimental papers for this conference by Dan and Helen Milner and Mike Finley is about, it purports to be about foreign aid in Uganda, and it shows, very interestingly, that people in Uganda seem to prefer multilateral or even bilateral foreign aid from foreigners to government projects of a similar type from their own government. What the paper doesn't observe is how devastating that is for theories that say that democracy is the best form of government, because Uganda is a democracy, at least nominally, and foreign aid by the World Bank or the U.S. government is not democratic. The people of Uganda have no accountability control over it, and yet the situation where they have no influence, they can't hold the provider accountable, is more, they regard that in higher esteem than the situation in which they have, at least in principle or nominally, some ability to hold the providers to we're going to see, I think, in the next 10 or 15 years, a lot of soul searching about democracy. We've been through a period of celebration. And as C. Wright Mills said a long time ago about the United States, periods of celebration are usually overdone, and there's an underside. And I think we're going to see some more criticisms, a more critical attention to democracy, and not the assumption that has in fact dominated public policy, but also has dominated much of the profession, that democracy is necessarily and out of context the best form of government. I'm kind of with Churchill that it's the worst form of government except for all others, but that's a somewhat different orientation toward it. So back to political science. Without a political science, it'd be hard to have effective democratic leadership, because it depends on accountability, and that is based on critiques of action which are realistic with respect to what is possible. Without a vibrant political science, leaders would be guided only by their limited personal experiences, historical analogies, and folk wisdom, all highly unreliable as a basis for inference, and publics would be deprived of a scientific basis for criticism. So we should therefore, I think, judge our work not according to some idealization of science or by the standards of the physical and biological sciences, in which case we will fall short and will for a long time fall short. Unlike Newtonian physics, we cannot properly aspire to knowledge of grand covering laws that explain a myriad of disparate events. Instead, we should ask the more modest question whether knowing the political science literature on a given topic has prepared us better to anticipate what could happen and to assign probabilities to these various scenarios and to judge actual results. Are the findings of political science superior as a guide to historical analogies, extrapolation from the very recent past, and common sense? The answer is not always affirmative, unfortunately. And indeed, as I already criticized the herd instinct in political science, I think we need to widen our focus to topics that we haven't focused on enough. For example, I would say one of the most important questions in politics right now is, what is the impact of social media, new social media, on politics, comparatively and internationally? We don't know very much. We know virtually nothing scientifically about that subject, I think it's fair to say. And that's not surprising, it's new. What is surprising is that almost nobody that I know of in political science is studying that question. I don't know why every graduate student in the country is not after that question. The only good answer I can think of is that it's not a good answer. The only answer I can think of is that their professors aren't after that question because we're too old to understand social media. But that's not a good reason. So we need a little more boldness and a lot more boldness and imagination in the pursuit of our field. But I said at the outset of this lecture that I praised, at the outset of this lecture, I praised criticism and counseled criticism of one's elders. So I hope that all of you, from students to middle-aged professors, are dissatisfied with the accomplishments of earlier generations, skeptical about their inferences, and skeptical about what I'm telling you right now. I hope you see puzzling anomalies in some of the conventional wisdom, issues that need to be unpacked. And I hope that you have objections to express to what I've just been saying. Many of you will have noticed that my sources and examples come almost entirely from Europe and the United States, and from international politics, which has been dominated for 5 centuries by Europe and its offshoots. There's a sort of parochialism, therefore, about the way I've interpreted and presented this subject. This parochialism is presumably due in some measure to my own limitations, but it also reflects the discipline, which is heavily American, to some extent European, with relatively few genuinely important independent contributions from scholars on other continents. As the economic and political centers of gravity shift away from Europe and the United States, as we move into the post-American era, as Fried Zakaria calls it, with some exaggeration, this is bound to change. Political science will become a global discipline. It will, however, only prosper if liberal democracy thrives, for all its weaknesses. If we are doing our job, we political scientists will be irritating to political leaders. Since we illuminate their deliberate obscurities and deceptions, we point to alternative policies that could be followed, we question their motivations, and dissect the operations of organizations that support them and the governments over which they preside. they will try to buy us off, or failing that, if not prevented from doing so, to shut us up. As a result, we have a symbiotic relationship with democracy. We can only thrive when democracy flourishes, and democracy in a smaller way needs us, if only as a small voice of dispassionate reason. Our symbiotic relationship to democracy means that political science cannot be value neutral, nor can we be neutral with respect to order versus chaos, war versus peace. In our particular investigations, we need to seek objectivity, a goal that is never realized but we should strive for, because otherwise people with other preferences, or do not know what our values are, will have no reason to take our findings seriously. In the absence of a serious culture of objectivity, no cumulative increases in knowledge can take place. But the overall enterprise, despite what I said about objectivity, can never be value neutral. We should choose normally important problems because we care about improving human behavior and human politics. We should explain those choices to our students and readers, and we should not apologize for making value-laden choices even as we search unflinchingly for the truth, as unpleasant as the truth may be. So I hope you will consult your values as well as the literature in deciding what to work on. Try to work on things that are important, where the answer matters to you. It's not simply a puzzle like you might solve a crossword puzzle. It's something which really matters. You think that if people knew the right answer to this puzzle or this anomaly, we would have a better world in one respect or another. In conclusion, let me express the hope that younger political scientists, and probably everybody in this room is younger than I am, so it's an easy call, will see openings where we older political scientists see closure, and that you have ideas about how to move through those openings to the insights that surely lie behind them. There are certainly productive new interpretations to offer, and new descriptive and causal discoveries to be made. Some of you have already been formulating some of these new views. I look forward to your questions and to a stimulating discussion. Thank you for listening.
Efforts toward the rule of law.
Right.
To me, it seems that there's a wide history of whenever major legislation is passed, let's say in America, there's always major unintended consequences, or the anticipated financial impact is way off. So how can we look with any credibility at major complex legislation recently passed and the estimation of its impact financially, for instance, with some degree of accuracy? How do we get any credibility in that? And why isn't there more effort, if that were true, for more federalism, or where complex legislation is tried in some states in the messy field of real life before these federal laws are applied so suddenly to all states at the same time?
I'm not going to comment on the particular issue of federal-state relations, about which I know very little, but I think your general question is a good question. I would distinguish, the first thing to distinguish about unintended consequences is motivated versus unmotivated bias in the psychological expression. That is, sometimes people just make mistakes, right? Problems are complicated. There may be a systemic effect that is not understood by anybody at the time some legislation is passed, and there's an indirect effect that is not known. But more relevant to us as political scientists is, I think, is motivated bias. Very few tax revenue estimates in American states probably are understatements of the tax actually going to be received. I'm thinking of my state, New Jersey, where the governor egregiously overestimated tax revenues in plausible way, and now it's shown to be overestimated in order to pass a certain kind of budget. So we have a lot of motivated bias. Very few of us would expect about any government program which is about to be implemented, whether it's buying a set of fighter planes or providing medical assistance to people, that the costs have been underestimated by the incumbents, right? We would assume that the costs have been overestimated. They've always been underestimated because it makes it easier to sell the package. So there's a certain kind of motivated bias, and if we understand of what my colleague Stephen Krasner calls the organized hypocrisy of politics. We'll understand that we will look with a gimlet eye at all of these estimates, and we'll have a pretty good idea of where we think the error is going to be. If it's wrong, it's going to be underestimating the cost of a program that somebody wants. Or conversely, if someone doesn't want it, overestimating. But there's also unmotivated bias, which is a matter of the inherent complexity of much of the world. Yes.
You did mention other topics that you saw weren't being studied in political science, like social media and its impact on politics. What are some other fields that you see need to be studied?
I think we have there. If you think about the triad in international relations of trade, monetary relations, and migration, flows of goods, money, and people. If you do a search of those three fields, you'll find that migration is vastly understudied. It involves very important flows because these people can actually do things in the countries to which they go. They affect the politics there. And yet, we probably, I haven't done a quantitative study, my guess would be 1/10 as much as on trade and 1/5 as much as on monetary relations. So I think migration is a topic on which we need more work. There's very little, there are a lot of issues of environmental politics, international politics, very little work on it. Only one of the top 10, maybe none of the top 10 departments, only one or two top 10 universities have figures working prominently on international environmental politics. So, and I think there's a systemic reason for these shortages. I think that in the last 20 years, at least, graduate students have been very, very cautious. They tended to follow in the footsteps of their professors. So if you get a lot of professors who are working on a given topic, you'll get a lot of graduate students working on that topic. And if you have almost no faculty working on the topic, and that's true of both migration and environment at major departments, you don't get graduate students working on the topic. Well, it's perverse, of course, because if you look at the job openings, it's reverse, right? There are going to be more jobs in areas which people at the undergraduate level think should be studied, where there aren't very many political scientists, and fewer jobs relative to people out there in the overstudied areas. But we still have this perverse pattern, this kind of herd instinct of graduate students going in the direction where their professors go, and not striking out, not being bold enough and critical enough of their seniors and elders.
My question is regarding the upcoming election and the international relations that's happening right now, such as with Libya and Egypt. What kind of questions are political scientists asking right now about those, and how they're going to affect the election, and what kind of questions are we supposed to or should be asking about it, and how that is affecting our domestic politics?
I think that the effects of most events abroad on this election, with the exception of a major war, will be inconsequential. That is, we're already late in the election cycle. Early voting is beginning. The various polls say only 5% of people are undecided. And we know that foreign affairs are very low on the list of people's concerns. So my guess is, unless we get something like an Israeli attack on Iran or some other major international episode, we're not going to have much impact. Now, I do believe that we know something from political science. If we do have a major international incident, it'll help the president, whoever the president is. Kennedy's popularity rating went to a high point after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So his worst foreign policy action led to the highest popularity ratings because people rallied, and Bush's, George W. Bush's went to a high point after the invasion of Iraq. So it's not correlated with doing well. It is correlated with being, if there's a major international crisis, it'll help Obama. That's the one generalization I would make. Otherwise, I think there'll be no impact, particularly of these. Now, but what we, longer term, I think that the events of the last, this is very speculative, okay? I've said, I implied before that we should always assign uncertainty to our statement. I assign a very high level of uncertainty to this statement. It's not a scientific statement, it's my intuition. That we're going to see a reconsideration of democratization in the light of the Arab Spring actions. Because we had a pattern, one of my colleagues wrote a book about this recently, by which the United States systematically, in the interests of what it saw as its national security and economic interests, favored autocratic regimes in the Middle East. And they did so on the ground. One of the grounds was that anti-Americanism is so high in the Middle East that if they were democratic, they'd be anti-American, that'd be bad for us, and therefore they shouldn't be democratic. Now, that Condoleezza Rice announced a change in that policy in 2005, and I'm not sure it was implemented, but Obama certainly did implement it in Egypt in the last 2 years. And if we have an Egyptian regime which is hostile to the United States, a democratic Islamist regime, it's going to be a lot of soul-searching about the relationship between democracy and U.S. interests, which has been taken for granted as a positive one in the last 15, 20 years. When it was just the Soviets or their successors, or the Chinese communists are the other side, then democracy looks great. When it's anti-American democratic regimes or pro-American authoritarian ones, it's a more mixed picture.
I apologize if my question is less political, but I'm interested in how and when you made the decision to make politics a vocation, and how you have arrived to where you are today and where you were when you were in our shoes.
Well, it's a boring story, actually, because I was raised deeply immersed in politics. My dad was a professor of social science, and he taught political science. My mother and he wrote a high school civics text before I was born. So that's exaggerated, right? I couldn't have had any influence on that. And they were both very active amateur Democrats, so to speak, in Chicago. My mother was there's a story. She was a member of the Socialist Party in 1932, and she voted for, one of the greatest regrets in her life was that I think she didn't vote for Roosevelt because she was too radical. He was too conservative. She became an adamant New Dealer, a very strong New Dealer, and a very, very active participant. She actually was a socialist in 1932. In 1938, she served as a Republican poll watcher in the city of Chicago. Why a Republican? Had she changed her views so fast? Well, the Democratic machine controlled Chicago, and their practice of running an election was to have the policeman walk into the voting booth with the voter, guide her hand. That way you don't have to worry about them taking money and reneging on you. And she didn't think this was a very good way of running politics, and since there was no Republican poll watcher, because there was no Republican Party in the area, she was a Republican poll watcher. So I was kind of raised on politics. It was the stuff of family discussions, and so it's a little bit boring. It'd be much more interesting if I had been an apolitical family and had suddenly seen the light how one should study politics.
So I read in an interview with Foreign Policy that you see one of the most important issues in IR of our time being the rise of China. And so just a few interrelated questions. Do you think that China wants to serve this, more involved role in world politics, and does that matter? And how do you see the world with China as that more key player?
Okay, there are three questions there I think I want to answer. I want to respond to. The first is a general issue of the rise of China. If you approach that as a political scientist, the first thing you'll do is to ask, what is the class of events of which this is one? That is, the rise of a major, the revival economically of a major continental power, a state, and its ability, therefore, to challenge whichever power has been dominant before. And if you look at that issue, there's a lot of work on that issue. You can learn a lot. You can learn a lot about the rise of of England in the 17th century against the Dutch. You can learn a lot about the failed attempt by the French to overthrow English hegemony overseas. You can learn a good deal about the rise of the way the British accommodated the rise of U.S. power. The U.S. was a China of 100 years ago in a certain way, and didn't succeed in accommodating the rise of German power. So World War I and arguably World War II examples. So the first thing you do is you look at this in a comparative perspective, not in just one case. You're not going to find out enough from one case, especially one case that's future. Now, the comparative perspective is not going to give you a set of answers. It's going to give you a set of questions. It's going to raise, it may raise some of the right questions, and you'll see there's been variation in the outcomes. So there was no Anglo-American War in 1900, although people thought there might be. There was a World War I, which involved Britain and Germany. So you got variation in the outcomes, you've got a class of events, then you can get working on that kind of problem. So you ought to understand that background. Anybody who's going to look at China ought to have some understanding of that generic problem, just because of raising the questions, not giving answers. The second issue is, you said what China wants, and I warn you against that question, because China doesn't want things. China is a country of 1.3 billion people. The government of China is a complex, shifting set of political coalitions. Bo Xilai might have been powerful in China next year, but he's not going to be powerful in China next year. And so there are almost certainly different preferences among different Chinese leaders and different Chinese groups. So the second question is would we say, well, you're going to look at what China wants, look at the various influential groups in China and what their interests are and what their long-term, they think their long-term where their long-term advantage lies. For example, you might want to look to see which groups would benefit and profit from long-term stable trading relationships with the West, and which groups might benefit and profit from territorial aggrandizement or extension of power in the South China Sea. And then your last question is a very good question. What's the world with China going to be like? And I think the first start there goes back to Kenneth Waltz. You'd say there's a difference between a unipolar world where there's one dominant state and a bipolar world where there are two states of rough equality. And we have had a unipolar world since 1990. And at some point in the future, we're going to have if China keeps rising, we'll have a bipolar world. And we know some things about those relationships. You'd want to learn more about them. It's quite contested, actually, still, whether a bipolar world is relatively stable, as Waltz held, or unstable, as traditional balance of power theory held. But that's a good question. And then you want to say, well, you'd want then to study other situations where there's been bipolarity with the rise of one state. And you have to ask, under what conditions then could that be peaceful? I don't think you want to ask the question, what will happen, because these are probabilistic. And because the scientific question is not, is this going to happen, but under what conditions will it happen? Under certain conditions, the U.S. and Britain became a peaceful pairing where there could have been a war. Under other conditions, Britain and Germany fought it out, even though, after all, their monarchies in 1914 were from the same family, right? So we're not talking about inherently different. Those are the kinds of questions I'd ask. It's a good question.
How do you see the Syrian conflict ending? Not technically ending, but...
I have a very good friend who says, never comment on a country you haven't at least flown over. So I'm not going to comment on the specifics. I will say that we know some things that are relevant to this, right? We know that it will not, I think we're very sure it will not end in Syrian democracy in my lifetime. Because violent revolutions in places that have no history of democracy don't lead to democracy. Right? So we could rule out that option, that 5 years from now we're going to look around and Syria has a thriving democracy. I think that's virtually, very, very low probability, virtually zero. Who will win the struggle is another question. You'd have to be an expert on ethnic politics to know what is likely to happen if the Alawite minority no longer runs Syria, and then you have to ask who's going to run it. My guess is it's going to be a long period of violence and instability in Syria. There's no easy end to this conflict. And one question you could ask is, how likely is it that it'll spill over into an internationalized conflict? And once again, that's can happen. So it's mostly questions, I think. I don't think anybody can give you a very good answer. But the one thing I would rule out is the dream that somehow we're going to have Syrian democracy in 2015.
Thank you.
One last question.
So the prospect of using my political science degree to enter academia or to study and research and teach these things is very attractive to me, to understand the systems better as a whole. But I'm also extremely tempted to simply enter the systems and participate in them and engage in the political systems. To what extent do you also feel that sort of temptation to enter in and participate in the systems instead of just studying or researching or teaching about it? And what would you advise political science students moving forward as what their engagement should be in these systems as they are learning about it as well?
It's a really good question. Well, I was raised in a family that was more activist than research, as I mentioned before. And neither of my parents was an independent scholarly researcher of to any extent. They were both extensive political activists at different times. So I came from that background. I think, and I in 1968, I was an amateur Democrat. I was in charge of Eugene McCarthy's campaign in the 7th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. And I spent almost all my time in that winter-spring campaigning for McCarthy delegates for the Democratic National Convention, which was, given the rules at the time, a difficult and frustrating task. So I've been both places. What I will say, well, I think I'll say two things. One is, I think it's very hard to do both at the same time. Basically, what I did when I left Swarthmore College for Stanford in 1973, I cut off my activist political ties. Once you're doing it, if you're in the same place, you get phone calls all the time, right? Went to California, nobody ever knew I had been an activist. So that's, I think you have to choose. I really think so. Also, I think the temperament is different. The scholarly temperament stands back, is critical of one's own preferences. I prefer democracy, and I've been critical of democracy here. The political, you can't do that in politics. The words will be thrown back at you. Oh, you're running for office and you think democracy is terrible, right? End of story. So you really have to, I think you have to make a choice. And I think that ultimately it's what Weber said. It's what you have a passion for. It's what you, well, it's two things. One, it's what you think you're good at, because you may decide you're really good at one of these things and you're really only okay at the other. And then you should probably do what you're really good at. And but also you should do what you're passionate about. So I would interrogate yourself here. Are you essentially not just happier, but you feel more fulfilled, you accomplished more if you spend a month working on a political campaign that you care about the candidate and you think you make some contribution in the candidate's performance, success or not? Do you feel better about that, or do you feel better about sitting in the library mastering the theories of Robert Putnam and Eleanor Ostrom? Right? And I think deep down it comes to your gut feeling about which you really love to do. The people who want to sit in that library are a minority. So not knowing you ex ante, my guess is probably it's the activist route. That's 90%. But if you really have, Weber said this in Science as a Vocation. He said something like, if you think that the state, he said, if you think that the state of your soul, he said the opposite. He said, if you don't think that the state of your soul depends on solving a particular historical problem, you have no vocation for science. That's almost the quote, right? Now, state of your soul is a little bit extreme there, but what he meant was you really have to think it's about the most important thing in the world, that you solve this analytical problem. If you don't, if you just think it's a job or a task you won't be very good at, and you shouldn't do it. And I'm with Weber there. I think you have to ask yourself, do you feel this way about discovery and about science or not? And if you don't, as he says, if you don't feel that way, you have no vocation for science. You know, I'll do something else. Thank you. Thanks.